I got another email from Georgia. Most of our listeners are writing from Georgia. They're about to get opened back up, so our listenership in Georgia will go down. Everybody's going to be catching the virus. But Joseph writes, just a memory from my childhood I wanted to share. And I like sharing these intimate, personal communiques and moments from the cult listeners because it brings back memories for me, too. He says, the only time I ever saw my grandmother was when wrestling went on TV and she needed someone to turn the antenna to pick up another station, or when my dad would take us to one of the arenas in Georgia to see wrestling. I don't remember a ton about who wrestled or what the event may have been, but I do remember my 70-something-year-old grandmother wanting tickets on the front row because she was going to beat the hell out of Jim Cornette. I'm thinking it was at the Albany Civic Center. That's a very good possibility. But I remember Jim coming down the short walkway they had and my grandmother screaming at him at the top of her lungs that she was going to beat his ass. And he pulled his tennis racket back and said, shut up, you old hag. And that old woman had to be held down by my father. So, of course, from then on, Jim Cornette was on the side I was rooting for just because my grandmother couldn't stand him. Well, thank you, Joseph. That brings back great memories of getting attacked by elderly women in Albany, Georgia. And I want to ask you, when is the last time that you saw an old woman at a wrestling match?
You know, the other day, someone posted a photo somewhere. I can't even remember where it was from, but it wasn't like terribly long ago. It wasn't like the 50s. It was probably like the 70s, maybe even early 80s. And the entire like front row, not even a front row, the first few rows, mostly older people, men and women.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at that like, wow, that entire audience is gone from wrestling now.
Well, when I started going to the Gardens in Louisville, most of the first couple of rows were definitely adults, unless there was some adult bringing a kid, and a lot of older people because they were the reserved. They were the seats that they came and sat in the same seats every week, and they had been coming for years and years. And obviously, you had Bouncing Beulah in Knoxville. She was, so old, poor thing. She passed away not long ago. We talked about it, but she was so old, they built the building around her. But every town had multiple, there was a guy, everybody called him Grandpa, at the Louisville Gardens that one time in the 90s, he had been there so many weeks in a row, never missed a show for like 20 years or whatever, to the point that one week he wasn't there. And Ms. Jarrett, or whoever was running the show at that time, it was in the 90s, had Dean Hill announce that he was okay, just in the hospital for some procedure, and he'd be back next week because the fans were all asking and people were worried about him. And those were the loyal fans that were going to come no matter what the established local promotion, and it might change hands over the decades, but they would come to see pro wrestling, and they would bring their kids, and their kids would bring their kids. So I remember many times you had an old grandmother, her son or daughter and their spouse and the baby sitting on their knee. So there was like 4 of them in 3 seats because they didn't charge the baby. But that baby would 7 years later would still be going to the fucking matches every Tuesday night. And like you said, we've lost that completely because, well, number one, what adults, I want to say what adults over the age of 18, but especially today's wrestling, when you've seen the shit from guys that meant it years ago, and then you couple that with just the silliness and the goofiness. They keep saying that NXT's one of their bigger demographics is over 50 or whatever. Is that just because they are the only kind of halfway serious wrestling product? And because they don't really do anything to appeal to a senior citizen besides just actually wrestle.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't explain. I mean, that's one of the interesting things for a while now with all WWE programming beyond NXT is that even though it appears that they're marketing towards children, and they certainly treat the audience like they're either children or idiots, it's an older audience that actually is watching it more than it is a younger audience.
Well, it's the abusive relationship principle. They've always watched wrestling, so they're going to continue to watch wrestling. And this is the most familiar wrestling, the WWF, their WWE, the brand, even if it's all changed. If they just can't bring themselves to stop watching wrestling, that's what they're going to watch. But nobody goes to the live events anymore. Older people, especially not the old women that want to fucking attack the heels. And can you imagine an elderly person can you imagine a person over 50 in that All Elite Wrestling crowd? They would look like a fucking screen door on a submarine. Just completely out of place. And so it's become, unfortunately, with the lack of territories, the lack of local promotions, the lack of regular live events in every city, and the lack of seriousness and the lack of realness, instead of something for everybody, male, female, of every age and from every economic status and walk of life, it's become a niche nerd thing. And then the fans who remember when the shit used to kind of be good and you could get into it, and they're older and they're watching because they, are not going to stop watching wrestling. Like, I don't want to end this abusive relationship. I know it's not going to end well, but I can't bring myself to be the one. And that's what we're left with. And the numbers reflect that, do they not, at this point?
Yeah, it really does.